Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another one of our Tuesday Meet a Scientist lessons. I'm Spencer with Headwaters Science Institute. And for those of you teachers watching at home, I just wanted to remind you all that shortly after each of these lessons, we're going to be posting a homework assignment that has a few questions about today's talk that you can share along with today's video to your students watching at home to give them a way to check their comprehension and engage with the things we'll be talking about a little bit more. All of those things can be found on our website, headwatersscienceinstitute.org, under our online learning tab. I also wanted to share with everyone watching today that we've got some big plans coming up for Thursday. This Thursday is the big day of giving, where Headwaters and many other nonprofits across the country are raising funds for all the awesome things they do. I know right now with the COVID-19 pandemic has been a really tough time for inequality in education. The disparities between some of the schools that we work with and others have only grown with these challenges that we're all facing. And so that's why free science lessons like we're doing today are really important. And we hope that you can join us on Thursday on Facebook Live to check out some of the awesome things we have that day, including a very special guest concert from the Dead Winter Carpenters. So it should be a fun day. You can check out all the details and schedule for that on our Facebook page. And now for today's lesson. So I want to introduce to you our guest, Dr. Elizabeth Smith from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. How are you today, Elizabeth?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Perfect. And so I'm just going to tell you all a little bit more about Elizabeth and then turn the slideshow over to you all of that. So many of you may have heard of NOAA through the National Weather Service, which is where many of our weather forecasts come from. However, NOAA also has thousands of scientists who study all sorts of things related to weather and climate, just like Elizabeth here today. And I'm really excited because Dr. Smith here studies tornadoes. I love extreme weather and weather in general, and I have tons of questions to ask, and I'm excited to see what today's presentation is about. Just a reminder, if any of you have questions during the presentation, just type them in the comments, and then after the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask us any questions you have about weather or how Elizabeth here became a research meteorologist for NOAA. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to today's presentation.
Thanks. So yeah, so my name, like Spencer said, is Elizabeth, and I'm a meteorologist. But maybe it's not always exactly clear what that means. So what is a meteorologist anyway? Well, generally, when people think about meteorologists, they think of people like this, the people on our televisions that might tell us about the weather each day. And these people are often called broadcast meteorologists or on-air meteorologists. But there are, of course, other jobs that meteorologists might do. For example, like Spencer mentioned about the National Weather Service, another type of a meteorologist is an operational meteorologist. These are the folks that do the work to make forecasts every day for businesses, governments, and individual people like you and me. Here in the United States, we have the National Weather Service, which is actually made up of 122 individual offices across the country. So no matter where you live in the United States, a National Weather Center or National Weather Service office is responsible for issuing forecasts and warnings like severe thunderstorm warnings or maybe flash flood warnings for your area. For example, here in the state of California, you can actually see that there are 10 different Weather Service offices that have some area of responsibility in the state. Some of those are located in neighboring states like Las Vegas, for example, but there's somebody at least reasonably local to you that is watching your weather and issuing your products. Another type of meteorologist is a research meteorologist, and that's what I am. Research meteorologists are scientists that are tasked with asking and answering scientific questions about how our atmosphere works. For me and my work, that means that I am lucky and I get to go out into the field and collect observations of severe weather, like you can see me doing here in the back of this truck. As Spencer noted, I work at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory, or NSSL for short, and we're located here in the middle of the country in Norman, Oklahoma. We're located here because it's right in the middle of what's often called Tornado Alley, a part of the country where conditions are often right for severe storms and tornadoes, like you see here. I work in this beautiful building called the National Weather Center, where there are hundreds of scientists working together, including operational meteorologists, research meteorologists, and even scientists or students studying to become scientists or become meteorologists. And from this angle, you can also see just how flat it is out here in Oklahoma. One of my favorite fun facts to share about the National Weather Center is that it's home to the props from the movie Twister. Twister was actually somewhat inspired by a very real science project that NSSL scientists worked on in the 80s. And over here on the right, you can see the real instrument called Toto. In the center, this is the instrument that the bad guys in Twister use. This is called Dot. And here on the left is the instrument that the main characters in Twister use, called Dorothy. And they live right in the atrium of the building that I work in, so I get to eat lunch next to these every day. Toto, which you see over here, was lugged around in the back of a pickup truck where scientists tried to get in front of tornadoes and drop it out of the back of the truck so it could collect measurements of things like wind speed and temperature as the tornado passed. And so here's a picture of the real Toto in the back of a pickup truck. If you've seen the movie Twister, this should probably look a little bit familiar. And that brings me to what I want to talk with you about today. So how can meteorologists learn about storms by chasing them? But before we get into that, we need to have a quick primer on how to create a thunderstorm in the first place. So here I'm giving you a basic recipe for a pretty normal run-of-the-mill thunderstorm, which I have pictured here. There are three main ingredients: moisture, instability, and lift. Moisture is exactly what it sounds like. It's water vapor. And here in the United States, we get almost all of our water vapor from the oceans or the Gulf of Mexico that surround the continent. So atmospheric flow patterns, which you can think of as the large-scale wind that moves weather features around, carries moisture from the oceans over the land's surface. The next ingredient is instability. So it's kind of a funny word, but you can think about it in a really basic example, which I have up here. So this one says ball on a hill, but let's think about instead a bowl, a cereal bowl on your countertop. And so you have your cereal bowl sitting upright, like you should, on your counter, and you put a golf ball in it. So this will be the stable example. So you have a cereal bowl with a golf ball, and you can reach in there and you can tap the golf ball, and it might roll around a little bit. But at the end, it's going to settle right back down in the middle of the cereal bowl. And this is a stable condition. In the unstable example, we flip the bowl over. So now your bowl is shaped like this on your counter, and we set the golf ball on top of it. Now, if you tap the golf ball, it'll likely roll away, roll off the counter, and it's not going to end up back on top of the cereal bowl on its own. So when we're talking about the atmosphere, unstable air is air that, if perturbed or if bumped, it will rise. Stable air will return to its starting position. So you can kind of think about the air like a lava lamp. This is a really basic example, and it's not exactly correct, but it's a good way to just visualize it. So in a lava lamp, like I'm showing here on the side, the lamp at the bottom is warm, and it warms up the lava or the oil or whatever it is that's in the lava lamp until it becomes warmer than the air around it and becomes unstable. And at that point, it can begin to rise until it becomes cooler than the water in the lamp and it falls back down. So that's kind of how the atmosphere can work too. The sun rises and it warms the surface, which acts like the lamp in the lava lamp, and you can get these pockets of air that become unstable. But just like the golf ball in the bowl, even if it's unstable sitting on top of the bowl, we need something to bump it. You had to tap it to get it to start moving. So the third ingredient we need for a thunderstorm is lift. And lift can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. One of the most common types of lift is lift generated by fronts, which you might have seen on TV in the newscasts before when you have a cold front or a warm front. And in this example, we're showing a cold front, and you can see that as the cold air advances across the surface, it pushes the warm air that it's moving toward up and over top of itself, and we get lift, and in this case, it's forming clouds. There are some other ways to get lift too. A common one is also terrain. So if you've ever been near mountains, maybe sometimes you'll notice it's snowing or raining on top of the mountain, but not where you are. And that's because air is being forced up and over the mountain, which can lead to lift. And if there's any instability, you can get clouds and precipitation. The third kind is what we call differential heating, which is a big term, but all it means is that one part of the surface can get warm and we get that unstable air like the lava lamp here, or the other side is covered by clouds or something, and you don't get the warming there. And so that leads the wind to move from the high pressure to the lower pressure, and you can get lift associated with that. So those are your three ingredients for a basic thunderstorm, but what about a supercell? A supercell thunderstorm is a large thunderstorm that rotates, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. But we can't get a supercell that rotates from just the basic three ingredients I showed before. We need one more secret ingredient, and in this case, it's wind shear. Wind shear is simply the change of wind speed or wind direction with height above the surface. So in this example, where we still have our regular thunderstorm, we have no wind shear. The wind is constant with height. And so if you think of the example of a pinwheel that you would hold and blow on to make it spin, in this case, since there's no wind shear, the orange flag and the blue flag are being pressed on with the same force in the same direction, and so it can't spin. But if we add wind shear, and now our winds are faster on the top, which means the flags on the top get pushed harder than the ones on the bottom, the pinwheel can begin to spin. A similar process can happen in the atmosphere and lead to rotation in storms, and this is what can lead to supercells. While not all tornadoes are associated with supercell thunderstorms, most of the strongest tornadoes are. However, not every supercell produces a tornado. In fact, only about 20% of supercells go on to produce tornadoes. So we know that there's a delicate balance of ingredients that have to come together for severe storms and tornadoes. But we still don't know why some storms produce tornadoes and others don't. Routine observations can help us understand some things. For example, in the United States, we have good satellite data, which can show us how clouds and weather patterns might evolve from space. We also have a really great network of weather radar across the country. At almost every single one of those weather service offices I showed you at the beginning, there's a weather radar. We also launch balloons 2 times a day from most of those weather service sites as well. So once in the morning and once in the evening. And these balloons, or weather balloons, they carry little instrument packages that can communicate back to us on the ground what the conditions are, like temperature, wind speed, all the way up through the depth of the atmosphere. So here's an example of some of those routine data from a very strong tornado case. This is actually the 2013 EF5, or strongest category of tornadoes that occurred on May 20th, 2013, right here in Moore, Oklahoma, which is quite close to where I live and work. So here's our satellite information. And this imagery is showing us the large clouds associated with the strong storms that were evolving at the time. And you can see more marked here on the map. Over here, this is the information that comes from our twice-a-day weather balloons. So this was the balloon that was launched in the morning on that day. The red line shows you how temperature changes with height, and the green line shows you how moisture changes with height. This is kind of a funny diagram to look at if you've never seen it before, but meteorologists spend a lot of time being trained to read these diagrams, and they're powerful and give us a lot of information about what the weather might be on a given day. Lastly, I'm also showing imagery from National Weather Service radar on this day. And so on this panel, this is reflectivity, which you might be familiar with if you watch the news on television. This is often the type of data they show you to tell you where it's raining or if it's raining somewhere nearby. This is data at the exact same time, but this is velocity data. And so this field shows us how air is moving toward and away from the radar, which is what red and green means. In this case, since this tornado was so strong, it takes pretty much no training to be able to identify where the tornado is. And in the velocity data, we can see that where the red and green come together. We know that red and green tell us that there's motion going toward and away from the radar right next to each other, which suggests spin. But you might notice that the satellite data can't really see anything going on below where the cloud is. And if you look at the quick example I showed of where the radar can scan, which is what this blue triangle is, you might notice that whatever rotation is being observed by the radar is probably rotation associated with the entire storm itself, not the tornado, which is below the radar beam. Also, these balloons that we launch, we usually only launch them twice a day. So in this case, the 12Z, or the morning data, was very old by the time the weather was occurring. So this is where research meteorologists come in. So research meteorologists like me go out in the field and take mobile instrumentation so that we can get closer and target specific parts of storms to collect information on. So for example, for the same tornado case I was showing you before, here is the operational National Weather Service radar data that's always collected. This is our routine observation. This is the same type of information, again, reflectivity and velocity, but now from a research radar that was deployed on this day. And so while the general characteristics are the same, you can see that in the research data, there are different features that we might be able to see. So different structures down here where the tornado is. And since the research radar was closer and pointed lower, we're likely measuring the velocity more associated with the tornado itself instead of with the storm. So we've been chasing for a long time, and I've talked a lot about weather radar. And early chasing projects were critical for radar development. We didn't always have a national weather radar network. In fact, when radar was first being developed for storm detection and warning, storm spotters were critical to provide confirmation about what the radar showed. So chasers would go out in vehicles like this one and take photos and videos of what they saw. And then they would bring that back and compare it to data that original radars were collecting. This helped meteorologists learn about the different types of signatures for severe weather that we can see in our radar data today. And this sort of work was very critical to the eventual investment for nationwide installation of weather radar. So Doppler weather radar, which can detect motion or winds, those velocity fields that I mentioned before, was finally installed nationwide in the 1980s. The nationwide capability to identify signatures like these has greatly improved our warnings. So here are some of those signatures in that same Moore tornado case. I have them labeled. So this is the tornado warning box. Everybody that lives in this box is getting a warning to tell them that a tornado is coming to their location. This signature that looks kind of like a fishing hook coming out of the big storm, this is called the hook echo. This is one of the classic signatures for tornadoes. Another very common signature is called the inflow notch, which is where you see no reflectivity here. And that's associated with really strong inflow winds, winds blowing into the storm, moving in and wrapping around. In really strong tornado cases, you can actually see the tornado marked by this circular ball here of the pinks and reds. In the really strong cases, when tornadoes are moving through populated areas where there are structures, or even in heavily forested areas where there's a lot of tree, the tornado tears stuff up and it lofts it up into the air. And the radar can see that, and it can detect what's often called a debris ball, which we see here. So like I said, being able to see these signatures has greatly improved our ability to issue warnings. So in the late 80s, when radar was first installed, you maybe had about 6 minutes, which is what's shown here on the y-axis, this is time. You had 6 minutes of notice before a tornado would get to your house for the warning to be issued. So that means the National Weather Service would issue a warning 6 minutes on average before a tornado would get to your location. So that was when Doppler radar was installed. And you can see in the years since then, this number has multiplied by more than 3 times. So in recent years, statistics show us that these warnings, like the one I'm showing here in the box, come to individuals with about 15 minutes of lead time. And that's truly improving the ways that we can save lives. But ground truth for radar isn't all storm chasing has taught us. So there were a couple projects in the 90s and 2000s called Vortex, or the Verification of Origins of Rotation in Tornadoes experiment. And these projects went out and placed the most mobile instruments ever together in the field. And you can see some of those here. So this is a bunch of cars with instruments on top that can measure things like wind speed, temperature, humidity, pressure, all the things we need to know as meteorologists. And so all of these cars represent all of these different points that are called probes on this map. And so what they were able to do is put the most instruments ever together at once on a single storm. And we were learning from this a whole lot. So what we learned is that there's this kind of cold blob of air that comes out of thunderstorms when they're really strong. We call this the rear flank downdraft. And the data we collected with all of these instruments was able to tell us that these rear flank downdrafts are very important to tornado formation and tornado potential. And what they learned is that if this air that's coming out in the rear flank downdraft is either too cold or too warm, tornadoes might not form at all. And that was a brand new discovery we wouldn't have been able to do without instruments like these. Later projects taught us even more about the insides of these storms and the insides of tornadoes through the collection of even more data. So you see more cars with instruments on top, which sometimes they don't fare so well in the hail. But also the invention or advent of mobile radars on the back of trucks, which allow us to get closer and get data inside storms. So we've learned a whole lot over the last just couple decades. Oh. So new projects, like the ones that I work on, have a new focus, the boundary layer, or the layer of the atmosphere that's from the surface to about 1 mile or so up. This part is where we all live. It's where we build things, where our crops grow, but we actually don't have very good information here. So I'm showing you the same cartoon I showed you before, but now with a mobile radar. So we have this ruler, which is not to scale, over on the right-hand side. And you can see that even with the mobile radar, we're maybe only able to collect data a few hundred to 1,000 meters above the surface and up. When we have mobile vehicles out with the instruments on top, they have data collected from those instruments at about 3 meters above the surface. So that's a lot of space between 3 meters and 1,000 meters that we're not really collecting much data at all. We do launch occasional weather balloons, and those can provide us data in between the 3 and 1,000 meters, but each balloon takes about an hour to fly. And so even if we launch them continuously, we would only have information in this layer every hour or so. So there's clearly a data gap in the boundary layer, but there are ways that we can address this. So I'm going to now show you an example of some data showing that boundary layer gap. My slide's being slow to load, so just hang on. So what I'm going to show you is a time series of temperature. And so it will show that over time, we collect information only at certain levels. So if we have a surface vehicle like this one, with a temperature mast on the front to be able to measure temperature. This is the type of information we can collect right at the surface. So this is time in hours, this is height above the ground, and the color fill indicates temperature. Now, if we're in a regular condition where we launch balloons just twice a day, that's what these lines are showing us. So at about 23:30 and 11:30, balloons were launched. And so we have information about how temperature changes with height only at those times. But you can see that everywhere else in between there, there's no information about how the boundary layer is changing. But with specialized instruments, we can fill that gap. And you can see that here. And so these data that I'm showing you in between are actually from uncrewed aircraft systems, or what you might call as drones. And drones are a new technology that are being used by meteorologists to collect information in that layer. There are lots of different types of instruments that we can use to get information in this data gap region. Here's an example. So this is the truck that I often operate in severe weather conditions. And I have that weather mast on the front that should look familiar. You'll also see a very beautiful supercell in the background and even a tornado ongoing while we're collecting data. But we have this fancy instrument in the back called a Doppler LiDAR. And what it does is it uses laser light, which is coming out of the LiDAR and going up through the atmosphere. And it can let us understand how wind direction and wind speed change with height, or understand wind shear. So that's a lot of what I do in my work. And so now I'm going to show you a quick couple fun videos. The first one is actually from this exact deployment. So if you're looking at the truck from this side, in the video I'm about to show you, you'll be seeing us from the other side of the truck. And so this is one of those weather balloons that I was talking about. And this is me and two of the students I've gotten to work with launching this balloon. And so we're in that inflow notch region of the storm. And so there's lots of wind being pulled into the storm. It's very, very windy. And Michelle launches the balloon, and away it goes. And this is just a photo of that same deployment. And so I just want to pause really quickly and say that in addition to doing really cool science, we also get to see some really amazing things. This is, in my opinion, just really quite beautiful. And it's really amazing to be able to have a job where you get to see this sort of power in motion. And one more fun video. This is at a different location, but again, we're launching one of those weather balloons. And in this case, the winds are quite strong. And so you'll see that I have to navigate to launch the balloon in such a way that I avoid getting it stuck in trees and power lines. So it's interesting work, but it can be tiring. So we just barely cleared these trees. So that's most of what I have to show you today. I do want to take a second and kind of recognize some of all of these really cool people that I've gotten to meet and work with. And really why I want to do that is because I want to remind you that science really is for everyone. There's not a perfect person that's built to do science. You don't have to look a certain way to do science. You know, there are ways to do science out in the field like I do. There are ways to do science from home with your family or your pets. And you know, it just really is, it's a group effort, and it's a great opportunity. And on that note, I want to quickly share a citizen science opportunity where you can help researchers like me improve radar. So I talked a little bit about ground truth for radar. Severe weather isn't the only weather we need that for. We need that for rain, for snow, for everything. And so there's an app called MPing that you can download, and no matter where you are, if you're witnessing weather, even if it's just, you know, plain rain, you can report that to us, and it goes into a database, and then we can compare it to the ways that we compute our radar data to make sure that our algorithms are doing what we think they do. So it's a cool chance for you to try to get involved and do some science. So now I'm happy to kind of take any of your questions. You can also find out more about NSSL at our website, and that's just nssl.noaa.gov. And you can also feel welcome to connect with me on Twitter. I'm always happy to talk science.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was great. And we can definitely put a link to the MPing app in this video as well for those of you watching at home who might be interested in doing that. So the first question that I have for you is, how did you first become interested in studying weather like this? What got you into doing these studies?
So I've actually been interested in weather for a very long time, pretty much since I can remember. I saw the movie Wizard of Oz a bit too young, maybe. And there's a scene in Wizard of Oz associated with a tornado, and it's coming to the house, and it's kind of scary for a little kid. And I grew up in West Virginia, which is a place where tornadoes aren't very common, but tornadoes can happen anywhere. But as such, I didn't live in a home that had a good, safe space for tornado shelter. And I was really, really concerned about this, so much so that my family ended up working with me to develop a tornado plan, which we never needed. But a family friend saw that fear in me and decided that one way to kind of address that fear was to turn it into curiosity. And so he went out and bought for me picture books from the Weather Channel about tornadoes. And I've been curious ever since. And so I've been following this path for a long time.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. The next question that we have for you is one that we ask all of our scientists, just to share with people a little bit about how science doesn't always work well the first time you do it. But do you have any experience you want to share where sometime during your research, maybe something didn't work out, or and you had to figure out a way to still collect the data that you're doing, or problem solve a solution?
Absolutely. So I like to think about this a lot, like the line from Toy Story where Buzz Lightyear is told that he's not flying, he's just falling with style. That's a lot of how science is. It's not this one direct path. It's mostly failing with style and figuring out how to adapt and problem solve. So talking about field work, which is what I've shown a lot of today, it's pretty much guaranteed that something is going to break or go wrong while you're doing this. And so the campaign that I showed you pictures of was actually this past spring, so in 2019. And we were a part of a really big group, 100 people or so out in the field trying to all get in the right place at the right time. And on our very first try, we do it. Everybody's where they're supposed to be. Like, it's perfect. Everything's going great. We get to our location, and we turn on our truck and we turn on our LiDAR, and it works for about 15 minutes and everything dies.
Oh no.
And so we weren't able to collect data on that first case, even though everyone else was in the perfect position. And that was really disappointing. It was just a silly mistake, something we learned from quickly. But I think what makes a really good scientist is someone who can go through that process. You fail, you're angry, you're upset, and you feel that, and it's valid. But you're able to move then into a space where you can treat that failure as something to learn from. And so we did. We learned from it. We learned what we needed to do to make sure that we could continue to collect observations. And it didn't happen again throughout the entire campaign because we made sure to learn from that mistake and just be better.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. So our next question from one of our audience members wants to know how close you get to tornadoes when you're out doing research.
So that depends a whole lot on the type of data you're trying to collect. So those cars that I was showing that have like the broken windshields and the instruments on top, they get really close because what they're trying to do is collect information about how the wind and temperature and stuff like that is changing in the very near field of tornadoes. So, within thousands of meters. So quite close. When you're working with an instrument like the one that I was showing, the Doppler LiDAR, it's really hard for that laser light to get through rain. So you want to be sure to stay out of the rain. So we're usually probably about a half mile to a mile away. But what we actually try to do is we try to get there ahead of time and park. So we're pretty far away, maybe 5 miles away. And then we wait and we let the storm approach us until we don't feel safe anymore. And we have good safety plans, at which point we can quickly undeploy and get out of the way. So close.
Perfect. That's great. And so we have a question here from one of our audience members about many women in meteorology, or if there are any young women at home who might be interested in becoming a research meteorologist like yourself, any steps that they might be doing, you might recommend.
So it's a great question, and it's something that people in our field talk about a lot. The answer used to be no, it's changing. There are more women in meteorology now than there used to be, even in just the last 5 years, since I've been in Oklahoma. When I first arrived at Oklahoma as a graduate student, I think I was 1 out of 4 women that were in my class. Now there are a lot. The classes are about 50-50 split, but that hasn't necessarily translated to the workplace, but it is getting better. And so what we've been working on is outreach opportunities like this one to show people that scientists don't have to look a certain way. And what I usually tell young women when they ask me questions about this is that nobody can tell you what you can or can't do except yourself. And sometimes things are hard being the only person or one of few in the room that look like you. But if you look hard and you're willing to look outside the box, you can always find somebody who's an ally. And leaning on those allies and being part of change really kind of helps get over some of the tiring hurdles that come with being one of the only in the room. So stick with it, stick in those math classes, stick in those science classes. And if somebody says you're annoying for asking why, then be annoying. Keep asking why. Questions are what makes good scientists.
Perfect. Well, that's great. That's an awesome answer there. So the next question that I have might be a little specialized, but I wonder what you do it. So I've been reading in the news a little bit how the NOAA gets a bit of data from commercial airline flights. And with the COVID pandemic, there have been fewer commercial airline flights. And I was wondering if that had any impact on some of the data that you as a scientist might collect or get to use for kind of watching storms in there.
Sure. So I would be what's called an observational meteorologist. So most of my work is focused on the observation data. There's another whole sector of meteorologists in NOAA and in other sectors as well that focus more on our numerical modeling tools or our computer models that can help with forecasts. And those aircraft data that you mentioned are crucial for modeling. And so what happens is we have a first guess of what the atmosphere looks like. And what we do is whenever we have specialized observations like those that become available, we can add those to the model and say, okay, model, here was your first guess, but here's an observation of the truth. So let's get a little bit closer. And it's been shown that the types of observations that those aircraft that you've mentioned can collect are important to initializing and improving our models. So with fewer flights, there is concern that perhaps our numerical forecast could be degraded. But there's hope because a lot of our observations from aircraft actually come from the cargo planes. So UPS and FedEx aircraft, which even though commercial flights aren't flying as often, those are still flying. So there are still data, but there are fewer data. But it'll take some scientific studies to really explore what those impacts were to quantify if they did degrade our numerical forecasts.
Cool. That's interesting to learn a little bit more about how all those numbers come together behind the scenes. So the next question that I have is, we have a lot of students at home who might be doing their own science projects. I don't know if you have anything you might be able to suggest or a favorite home weather related project that you like to do that some of the audience might want to try out at home.
Absolutely. So I have 2 ideas. So the first one would be more of like a craft or hands-on project, and it's called Make Your Own Thermometer. And so with stuff that you have around the house, you can actually build your own very basic thermometer. And so all you need is a water bottle, a straw, and something to seal the top. Usually we use something like Play-Doh or clay. And then in the water bottle, you put, I think it's about half and half water and rubbing alcohol. And you only fill it up for a couple inches, and you put some food coloring in there so you can see the liquid. And if the top is sealed the way it should be, the thermometer works the exact same way basic liquid and glass thermometers work. And so if you take it outside, the warm air should cause that liquid to expand and actually go up the straw. And you can build that right at home.
Oh, cool.
So that's kind of a fun thing to do. If a student is a bit more interested in using real data, the National Weather Service and NOAA are federal entities from the federal government, which means all of our data is available. And so if you just do a simple Google search for NOAA weather data, you can find observations of almost anything. And so, you can look at your hometown and maybe start to play with the data, maybe with a coding language like Python or Microsoft Excel, something like that, and you can actually chart maybe what the temperature is, in your hometown through a year, something like that. And all of that's freely available.
Cool. That's awesome. Data sets are really fun and to play with. And so that's a really great idea. Awesome. Thank you. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to tell us all about tornadoes and the awesome science that you do. So we definitely appreciate it. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. And for those of you watching at home, we encourage you to join us again on Thursday for a couple awesome programs that we have also on Facebook Live. And that's all that we have for today. Thank you for watching at home. Thank you, Elizabeth, and we'll see you all next week.